All right, golfers, let's talk about the pros and cons of creating flexion in your lead wrist. Big buzzword there everybody's talking about. Now, all else equal, flexion will tend to close the club face. So if you're a player with a weaker lead hand grip, a lot of times flexion can be advantageous to get the club face back to a square or more square position. Now, if you're a player with a stronger lead hand grip, a lot of times flexion could be beneficial, but it could also hurt you, especially if the club face gets too closed. That can make golf really, really hard. So I would be very careful, depending on your grip type, of how much flexion you're going to create. Now, another thing I'd like you to consider is the length of your backswing, and then maybe even more importantly, where your club tends to point at the top of your backswing. So here's what I mean by that. If you're a player with a shorter backswing, let's just pretend all the farther you can get back is about right here, call it shoulder high. Okay, well, a lot of times flexion will tend to shallow the club. So you can see the club start to point more to the left of my target for a right-handed player, or laying the club off. This can be advantageous because the backswing is so short, the downswing is also going to be pretty short, and this club is almost preset in a shallow position. So as I start down, you can see this club is in a more horizontal position, right? The club head itself is pretty far behind me, and as I start down and rotate and stay in posture, you can see the club head still stays behind my hands. Really nice to have a pretty good swing direction, pretty good club path, and hit the ball pretty straight. But let's consider the other alternative for backswings. If your backswing tends to be longer and you lay the club off, well, now as I start down, this club is already in a shallow position. It's very unlikely to stay there as I start down. And a lot of times, because of where the balance point sits and because of the force we're applying with our hands towards the ball, what will happen is this club will actually start to slowly steepen throughout the entire downswing. And so by the time the club gets down to the ball, the club is actually working out to in on the ball. And some players can even sense this, and they'll do something crazy with their pivot, like tilt to the right or lose their posture to get the club to come back from the inside. Well, when we analyze this backswing position, I want you to understand that flexion tends to lay the club off even more. So if you're a player with a longer backswing, this is why this is important. In my preference, to not see the club get too laid off, and therefore probably don't want to overflex this lead wrist, again, for the reasons stated before, where the club will tend to want to get a little bit steeper. But if you are a player with a shorter backswing, again, I think this can help you preset the club in a shallower position and kind of keep it shallow in transition and make sure that your downswing is kind of in a usable place. So take into consideration the length of your backswing. If it's a longer backswing, we want to maybe steer clear of too much of this. Again, not saying it can't work. Obviously it can, but I would just be very careful about how your club moves from the top down. Okay, the last point is kind of how speed is created. So I want to introduce a couple terms here. You know, we have our flexion, we have our cupping or our extension, but there's two other words I want you to learn. So if I point my hand or my fingers down as far as possible, that's called ulnar deviation. If I go up with my thumbs, okay, that's more radial deviation. And I want you to understand flexion, again, this term we've been talking about, and ulnar deviation or downward hinging, they tend to go together. So let's say, for example, you're a player trying to create more club head speed. A lot of times players will reference this angle between the lead arm and the shaft, and they'll say, well, the more angle I can get here, the faster I can swing the club head. And I think a lot of studies have shown that to be partially true. Okay, so if I'm a player trying to create all of this angle, well, remember, flexion pairs really well with ulnar deviation, which almost creates like no angle. Okay, so if you're trying to create a lot of flexion and a lot of speed, again, this can be really challenging just because of anatomy and how our wrists were built. But instead, if you're a player that has a little bit of extension in the left wrist, again, I don't know if this is you, but it can be easier to create more angle between the lead arm and the shaft. Now, whether that's good for you or not is up for another debate. I think there's a lot of studies out there that are showing, you know, the wider your angles are, the more club face control potentially you could have. So there is kind of a trade-off there between power and accuracy that I would want you to consider for your own game. So check out your grip, make sure the top of your backswing's in a good spot before you decide to add any of that flexion, and then consider your club head speed before just diving in and flexing your lead wrist as much as possible.